Trish and Rob McGregor welcome you to a place where all kinds of phenomena flourish. Voices whisper ancient secrets, signs and symbols are abundant. UFOs, ETs, ghosts, and even the dead move about freely. Here we meet authors, researchers, and investigators of the mysterious, the strange, and of the inexplicable anomalies that surround us. Step out of the everyday world and take a journey into the mystical underground.
Welcome to the Mystical Underground. Thank you for joining us. This is Trish McGregor and
Rob McGregor.
And our producer and tech magician, John Posey. You can go to themysticalunderground.com where we make regular blog posts and where you can find out about our books. Among them are The Secrets of Spirit Communication, Sensing the Future, and Aliens in the Backyard. Our most recent book is called Mind-Blowing Synchronicities, the latest science, stories, and research. Trish's latest novel is White Crows, and Rob's latest is called Tulpas. If you're watching us on YouTube, we would appreciate it if you take a second to click the like, subscribe, and notification button so you never miss an episode. If you prefer to listen to the show, it's available wherever you listen to your podcasts, so please subscribe there. Our guest today is Miguel Conner, a writer, voiceover artist, and host of the popular podcast Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. His books include Voices of Gnosticism, Stargazer, Heretic, and Executioner's Daughter. He lives in Northern Illinois.
Hey, I was going to read that, Trish, but that's all right.
Go ahead, Rob.
You already did it. Okay.
Well, anyway, welcome, Miguel.
Yeah, welcome, Miguel.
Thanks for having me on. No need to read it twice.
Yeah, right. So, how did this book come about? Or I have the feeling, having read most of it, that you didn't begin as an Elvis fan going into this.
Not at all. I always consider myself a Beatles person. And, I never really knew much about Elvis except for one bio. And yeah, I'd read some blog posts about his that he was a theosophist and this and that. But I always assumed, like many, that, oh, well, he was a spiritual person, he was eccentric, but, isn't that what rock musicians and celebrities do? They're eccentric, they're into weird stuff, and they give us music, so I didn't think much about it. Again, his music did nothing, but the universe always has other plans. What did John Lennon say? Life happens when you're busy making other plans, and life certainly happened to me, and it was summer of 22, a whole series of visions, synchronicities, and other high strangeness hit me, and it led me to become obsessed with Elvis, listening to all his music, remembering the bio and some of his supernatural gifts and experiences and all that. And before I knew it, this voice, this power, urged me to start writing this book. So on a cold February 1st night, I sat down with just that bio, knowing very little bit about Elvis. I watched the Baz Luhrmann movie, so I had that extra, and I found myself loving his music, and I sat down and wrote it. And 3 months later, this book was channeled, came out of me. I like to call it, I became quantum entangled with Elvis. We became almost one. So, and that's it. And a few months later, I had a book deal. The publisher was interested. They resisted because they admitted they were all Beatles people. But at the end, they had to, they knew that this was something very interesting, something that's been overlooked, and something it's time for the world to really experience in their fullness. It's no secret, these things about Elvis, but the magnitude, the depth, and again, how it's been overlooked for so many decades, even though it's all recorded in bios from Priscilla, from a spiritual teacher. It's all there. But again, it seemed the world just didn't want to accept it.
Yeah, so what kind of synchronicities did you have?
Well, it'd be, for example, the usual stuff. I would be on a podcast on Aeon Byte, and I would be talking to the guest, and she would suddenly say, oh, I used to date David Stanley, who was Elvis's stepbrother, and we did a documentary. I was like, oh, that's very
Oh, that is
interesting.
interesting.
And she would start talking about his supernatural powers. I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then, going to the store and seeing Elvis, going to a bar or restaurant and playing Elvis. It was just over and over. It was loud and clear. When your soul's open, what the universe is telling you.
Yeah, we had a little preview of this interview last week when before the interview we were doing. I asked John, who's in Alabama, if he'd ever been to Tupelo. And the reason I mentioned Tupelo was because there had been a big storm there and there was a lot of damaged houses.
And our guest had to cancel.
And our guest who lives there had to cancel. And I didn't realize that Elvis was born there, actually. I thought he was from Memphis. So I'm a Beatles guy, too.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I think your guest P.D. Newman?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, same reason. I'm having troubles, and I understand because, it's bad, and it is an odd sync. Elvis was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, and as my book, one of the main themes is fate, and can we create a destiny out of fate, to the cruelty of fate, which Elvis is an amazing case study on this. But a year after Elvis was born, they had also a tornado there. And it was horrible. 240 people died.
Jeez.
And the city was ravaged. And the only reason hundreds more didn't die is because it was a Sunday night and most of the population was at church at the Assembly of God. Elvis was probably there with his parents. And it's still one of the top tornadoes when it comes to devastation and death in the United States.
Yeah, apparently PD lost the roof of his house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I've heard. Yeah, poor guy.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So I suppose they thought the apocalypse had come when that big tornado hit and everybody is in church.
Yeah, evangelical Christians, you know what they're going to say. It's the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah. So how does your book differ from Gary Tillery's The Seeker King? Because he goes into some of these aspects as well.
That's the bio I had, actually. The years ago, I got the book through Quest from the Theosophical Society, and I had the honor of interviewing Gary. And he goes into a lot of detail. His is more of a linear biography, so it does include a lot of Elvis's life, concerts, making it big, all that, but his focus is on the spiritual and seeker aspects of Elvis. So he does bring UFOs, supernatural abilities, and other things. Mine is more, it's non-linear. It's more about themes and categories to try to understand Elvis from a bigger picture. And I go more in depth of, again, his occult life. And let's face it, it was published in 2013. Since then, more has come out, including like Ginger Alden, his last girlfriend. She didn't release her bio till like 2015, and she talks about Elvis, manipulating the weather and be able to cure ailments in her and other and her girlfriends and so forth. So, and there's stories in the newspaper and other people talking. So there's even more that has come out. So that's what my book sort of takes from Gary's and expands upon it.
Yeah.
What role did his stillborn twin play, do you think?
Primary, huge, the main one. Yeah, without a doubt. Jesse was born. They were both born on that January 8th. And Jesse came out not alive. And 35 minutes later, Elvis came out. And we all know and understand the idea of how connected twins are in life and devastating when one vanishes or goes to their next incarnation in the next one. What is only known today is the idea of the twinless survivor. I mean, twins are still communicating and very soul connected in the womb. So what happens is when a twin passes, the other lives with this huge sense of guilt and questioning of life. And that was probably the biggest event that drove Elvis. That's what led him to understand or ask the bigger questions of life. Why did I survive? Why did we have to be born in abject poverty when we could have been at a hospital instead of having the delivery at home? And then later, why did I suddenly become filthy rich and famous? Is there a purpose to this? And Jesse became as I call him, Damon or higher self. He would appear in dreams. He would appear as a voice, sort of guiding him. But that was the single biggest factor for Elvis in his life. And twinless survivors, as now we have more research, they have certain characteristics. They are, again, metaphysically prone and curious. They're very artistic, but on the shadow side, they tend to be workaholics. They tend to have a propensity for drug addiction, and they have a hard issue connecting with other human beings. With Elvis, obviously the opposite sex. He can never be monogamous. And so they have issues, and they can be very self-destructive in the end. So that explains, the idea of fate and destiny. And other twinless survivors that are famous are Liberace and Philip K. Dick. And sort of I talk about the, I don't know about curse or condition of being a twinless survivor.
I didn't realize that about Philip K. Dick. That's interesting.
Yeah, he always said all of his fiction, which we know today is Blade Runner, Total Recall, Minority Report, it was all because of Jane, the twin he lost. It was everything to him. Everything moved him. And he famously said, when somebody asked him, well, how did it feel to lose your twin? He said, I guess I got all the milk. Very powerful, which meant he was full of guilt all of his life and trying to understand, why did the universe take away this essential part of me?
Yeah, and Philip K. Dick really did, unlike Elvis, really did not become famous until after his death, unfortunately. So he lived pretty much in poverty as he wrote all of these great books that are now, classics.
He did. Obviously, I have a whole chapter comparing Elvis and Philip K. Dick, a lot of similarities, but both are history-changing individuals, obviously. Like you said, with Phil, it was after his death that he became a cultural phenomenon and influenced so many writers and movie directors and all that. But yeah, Elvis obviously made it big long before, but they both died at an early age. Philip K. Dick, I think, was 52, Elvis 42, and obviously the drugs, the workaholism, the self-destructive habits, poor diets, and all that just cut short two very bright lights.
What about
check to see if any of Dick's books have been banned?
I don't. No, they haven't. And real quick, because disembodied voice of John here, but that Philip K. Dick, along with George Lucas, Chris Claremont, Rob McGregor, and Whitley Strieber were my childhood. I mean, that was my childhood. So it was a really rich literary childhood that I had to come up in.
That's cool.
For sure.
Yeah. So what about the mother factor, Gladys? How did that play into Elvis?
That's the other one, right? Fate. Let's keep it with fate and destiny. And you can't blame her, but at the end of the day, she was an abusive human being. And I say this because when Jesse died, they took Elvis and Gladys to the hospital. She was given the news that she could no longer conceive. So it's only, logical what would have happened. She became a very possessive person over Elvis. And today we laugh and call it helicopter parenting. But it is a form of abuse. It's called lethal enmeshment. And the mother basically doesn't allow the child to go explore and be independent. He becomes sort of a proxy or surrogate husband or lover to the mother in a symbolic way. And that way they had she was abusive, and it was a very unhealthy relationship. And Elvis found himself always at the extremes, which happens in this. He's either a caretaker or a crazy, carefree child. Very extremes. There's no middle ground. And that we see that with Elvis throughout his life. And again, children who suffer from lethal enmeshment, they are creative, they are spiritual, But guess what? They're workaholics. They tend to be addicted to drugs and tend to be self-destructed. So right there off the gate, Elvis, it was all faded. And even more, Gladys had this sort of second sight, or I call it witch blood, or whatever you want to call it. She had the ability to see, I don't know, shadow people and things in the night. She had premonitions. Elvis and her used to be able to astral travel even, and they kept it hidden because of, where they lived, conservative Christian in the South. So she had some sort of witch blood or DNA, and she passed it on to Elvis. And these things, obviously, as you guys know, they are both a gift and a curse. So, yes, there was a lot of, and then you include the tornado and other things. So Elvis's fate was almost sealed, and from the very beginning, he was destined to be Elvis.
What about what happened to his father, Vernon? He didn't seem to be much in the picture after his birth.
No. I mean, Vernon was very, I guess we call it today, a beta male. Nice guy, not ambitious, just wanted to get along and live his life. But yeah, once Elvis was born, which happens is that the father gets sidelined, and Elvis as a kid is sort of the husband. But they were a close-knit family, had a lot of eccentricities, like Elvis sometimes slept in their bed till he was 16. A lot of it is because he was a horrible sleepwalker. And there were times, even when he was famous, he almost like walked off a building or so a lot of times it was because of his sleepwalking, or times when when Elvis was asleep, she would take the doorknobs off of his door because she was so terrified that he would go anywhere. So it was an interesting trinity, but they loved each other. They were spiritual. Gladys always told Elvis, we are all equal under the eyes of God, so don't think anybody's better or worse than anybody, and that includes you. So there were positive things in the way she raised them. But with this lethal enmeshment, logically, when Gladys, again, died early, I think she was 41, Elvis was destroyed. It just devastated. It added to the trauma of losing Jesse, and he never really recovered from it. It was, again, too much, which, again, sealed his fate, but also led him to still be looking at the great answers of life. So a lot of trauma there, and it were horrible instances, like one time Vernon was frustrated, and he told Elvis that the reason his mother died was his fault. And he wasn't wrong, because Elvis got famous to take care of his family, his mother, his cousins, so he didn't care about money. Elvis could, he liked doing other things, singing, praying, meditating. But when he got famous, it actually did damage, because Gladys hated his fame with a passion. And the more famous he got, the more she started drinking and taking pills and being stressed out. And once Elvis got called into the army, it was too much of a shock to her system. She got sick and she didn't recover. So it was kind of like a deal with the devil, right? Make me famous, but there's a price to pay.
Miguel, when you were writing this book, did he come to you in dreams or any kind of spirit contact?
More like in naggings. Yeah, it was this voice. I would be sleeping, and it's like, I am so tired. I stayed up till 1 a.m. writing, and this voice would say, "No, get up. You're gonna write some more." And yeah, he came in dreams here and there, more like feelings and pushes, tugs, if you would.
There was an interesting story that came apparently from Vernon, and I'd like to find out where the source of this, how this story came about. About when Elvis was born, there was this blue liquid-like light around the house that he saw. How did that story come about, And it's fascinating.
It is, again, fate. It's like, was Elvis dropped in the mothership? Was this, great figures, whether it's Jesus or Alexander the Great or Buddha, there's a heralding light or star that comes. But there's two versions. And again, as you do these biographies, you're going to realize human beings are not reliable. They will contradict it. So sometimes you got to just put both stories and tell the reader, figure it out. But both stories say pretty much the same thing. It's when Vernon actually told Elvis, or decided to tell Elvis, that's in question. But when Elvis was born, Gladys was going through a very hard labor. Again, they were having it at their little shack in Tupelo, Mississippi. Again, they couldn't afford a hospital or a doctor. Some stories say that there was a midwife. Some others say no, just family members trying to get Gladys out. Remember, this is 1935 South, Great Depression. It's bad all over, right? It's really bad all over for Americans. And Vernon went out to have a cigarette to sort of take a break, and all of a sudden this blue light came over their house. Everything went silent. He couldn't even hear the coyotes or whatever nocturnal birds were there. The sound of the wind vanished, and he just sat there like freaking out, and he ran into the house, and he basically pushed it down, because a few minutes later, there was this great tragedy that happened. But then years later, he brought it up to Elvis, and Elvis was like, there are forces at play here.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Wow.
It's interesting.
What are some of the Elvis's extraterrestrial encounters? That could have been one of them, actually, but
that could be one. I count it as Vernon's extraterrestrial encounter, unless Elvis was the alien. But
right. Brought rock and roll to Earth.
Yeah, he had 3. And then again, it's hard because, and Elvis knew this, sometimes it's hard to separate a religious experience from an extraterrestrial. I mean, aren't they kind of the same? Whether it's an angel or a gray guy. Yeah, it's hard because he had
much more now than in the past.
Yeah, people
and blended.
Well, and was Little Richard an alien?
Looks like it. Elvis looks like an alien, especially in his Vegas manifestation, and it was on purpose. But I could say 3 like traditional extraterrestrial encounters he had. And again, I make sure in my book that these are reliable sources and that there are always eyewitness accounts for most of these stories. There was always somebody in the Memphis Mafia or Priscilla or somebody was around to see this. And one he had, I believe is in the New Mexico or Arizona desert. He was traveling from Memphis to L.A. because he went through a period he just didn't like flying, and he saw these lights moving in formations that defied human experience. And he and Larry Geller, spiritual teacher, and his bodyguards just sat there watching these lights do incredible things in the sky. Then you always have the post-UFO experience. Then, Larry Geller's like, could this be from the military? And Elvis is like, no, there's no way. We don't have the technology. And a big discussion came about aliens having telepathy, and they're the ones stopping the humans from destroying each other and so forth. The other one was in his Bel Air mansion in L.A., and he was with his bodyguard, Sonny West, and they're sitting there just enjoying the night. And this light floods the area. At first, they're like, oh, it's either a helicopter or a plane. And then they're like, oh, this is right over us. Oh, my God, this is not a helicopter or plane. It's not making any sound. This is an extraterrestrial experience. Elvis tells Sonny, go get Jerry Schilling, his other bodyguard and friend. I'll stay out here. He went in. They both came out, and Elvis was gone. And they're like, oh, my God, we had one job, and now Elvis has been abducted by aliens. But so they're running around screaming for Elvis. The light goes away, and they find Elvis like 2 doors or in the neighbor's yard, sort of looking at the sky. And then the other one happened in Graceland with Vernon. And again, strange lights and so forth. And some say that's where Vernon said, oh, my God, this reminds me of when you were born. And Elvis is like, oh, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Now, what did Priscilla have any of these experiences with him?
She would say that he in the arena of his healing powers, she would say that if she had a headache, Elvis could cure it at a touch.
Huh.
So, yeah, that's really it. I mean, she shares about them trying marijuana together, and it was one of those, oh, we got the munchies and got tired and fell asleep. We never did it again. She talks about they tried acid once together, and it was fun, goofy walls are breathing kind of stuff. But that's it. They never tried acid again. But and then she talks about some of his martial arts, how he was just incredible. He could kick the cigarettes out of a man's pocket, and she saw him do that once there was a fight at a gas station, and Elvis was there to stop it. But yeah, as far as that, there were also instances where Elvis loved going to morgues. He was obsessed with death, so they would sometimes at night go to a morgue, and Elvis liked to look at the bodies. And one time they saw a dead baby, and Priscilla started crying, and Elvis said, unfortunately, this is how life goes. But they both sat down and prayed for a long time so that the child's soul would get back to its source. But yeah, as far as Priscilla goes, I think those are the only ones.
Yeah, that is the story, including the book. They had, he and Priscilla had gone to this movie. I think it was a French movie about a murder on the corpse. I can't remember the name of it right now. And then afterwards, he said, "Wow, let's go. Why don't we go to the Memphis morgue and take a look at bodies?"
That's it. Yeah, I think it was Diabolique.
To do.
Yeah, Diabolique. That's it. Yeah. And Elvis could do that. I guess he could walk into places, and I think you also include one where he walked into a hospital. He wanted to see a birth.
Yeah, that's why I call him a shaman, because beyond his powers and his healing, shaman's job is birth and death. They are at the extremes. So he was obsessed with birth, and for us it may be strange, but in whatever mid-60s, a man being present for a woman's birth never happened. It was always the doctor, right? It was an alien thing. So his girlfriend, this was early 70s, it was Linda Thompson, said, I have a friend's wife, she's giving birth, and Elvis is like, we gotta go, shows up at the hospital, and it turns into pure mayhem because nurses are dropping, letting go of patients in a wheelchair and running out of room. Elvis is here, and that's what happened wherever he went. But he's walking around and he sees a woman pregnant who's in labor being led to the room. She's freaking out, and she looks like she's in pain, and he stands over and says, it's gonna be okay. He puts his hands on her, and the pain went away. And then Elvis is like, well, can I go into the room and watch it be birth? Of course, the woman is like, come on, Elvis. But the doctor was like, no, you can't be in her, sir. And he was very disappointed.
Yeah.
Did he ever heal himself of anything?
No, I think there are instances, I think he used like some sort of Tibetan magic when he had throat issues, and he had to be in concert, and one-time gut issues, but he never healed himself, even though he could, because as I write in the book, there's a concept of the wounded healer, those who have been traumatized and broken, and it opens their channels of communication to the spirit world. And these wounded healers won't heal themselves because they feel that their wounds is what allows them to heal others and empathize with others. It's their power. They heal not despite their wounds, but because of their wounds. And we see that in cultures across the world. Shamans are individuals who were broken young. They had a near-death experience, or they had some traumatic event, or they're born with a disability, and they are chosen to be the shaman of the tribe. So the wounded healer is important, and that's unfortunate because, Elvis, he could heal instances of heart attacks, broken legs, cancer, again, headaches, nausea, whatever you want to call it. He was a very good healer. He could make fevers disappear, but he couldn't heal himself. And I don't think he would have never done it. It just wasn't part of his job.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
What's his healing abilities? Was that very well known during his life? These stories?
Yeah, and it was natural. If there's one thing that Pentecostals and evangelical Christians have no problem with, is faith healing.
Right.
And it came from his family. When he was sick as a child, Vernon and Gladys put their hands on him, and the next day he was back to normal. Didn't have to go to the hospital.
Okay. So that fit into the Christian.
So Elvis going around healing people to his inner circle and fans in Graceland was like, it would have been fine. It meant he was a good Christian.
Right.
He
Yeah.
had his Chiron, the wounded healer, in his 5th house of
Mm.
creativity. So I think it was also a creative outlet for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with Elvis is like he was a very intelligent and astute person. He knew that his art, his magic, and him being a good person were all intertwined. In other words, if he was healing, it just meant he was getting closer to God, which is what he wanted. If his music was resonating, he was being closer to. If he could do a magic ability like make a bush shake or create a wall of energy, he wasn't doing it out of ego. It just meant he was taught by both Jesus and Yogananda that it means these are gifts from God. Come closer to me.
Did he ever talk about his dreams? Did he have any prophetic dreams? Like, did he see his own death, like Abraham Lincoln did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he did actually. So did Philip K. Dick. He always had terrible nightmares, car crashes, seeing Jesse in the grave, and all that, and premonitions. And I talk about it in the book. Not specific, because as I go in the book, I propose he knew he was going to die. And this was one ritual for him to go. It was a last shamanistic ritual. And he gave hints like telling Larry Geller, they were signing some documents that Geller was surprised, some legal documents. And he said, things are not going to go the way you want. Angels fly because they take themselves so lightly. And Geller felt a chill. And he was dropping hints. But his most... I would say fantastic or notable one was 2 days before August 16, 1977. His stepbrother, David Stanley, came in and was asking Elvis about some marriage advice. Elvis was always very wise. Again, he could heal others. He could give advice for everybody but himself. And Elvis was there on his bed, just his body was failing. He could barely see, but he was reading all these spiritual books. And he says, David, come here. I love you. I just want to tell you that in 2 days, I'll be on a higher plane. And David was like, yeah, in 2 days, we got a plane to Portland. And Elvis sort of rolled his eyes like, yeah, okay, but I love you. Get out of here. So he knew he was going and that his time was for his next vibration or incarnation was here.
Do you think he's been reborn?
I don't know about reborn. I don't,
or reincarnated?
Well, a lot of people would like that, right? Just as we're all Cleopatra and Napoleon, maybe we'll find out a lot of us are Elvis.
The honeymoon in Las Vegas, where they jump out of the airplane, about a dozen or more Elvises.
Yeah. Flying Elvis, a Utah chapter.
Yeah, right. I often wondered, were they first Elvis impersonators, or were they skydivers first?
Yeah. Who knows?
Yeah, right.
Who knows?
What came first, right? Yeah.
Well, and I do have to just throw out spoiler for an unaired episode that Freddie Mercury's coming back as well, so he's going to be reincarnated. So if you guys remember, well, there was a lot of drugs involved in that interview. So. Yeah.
All right, yeah, that guy, DMT, yeah. Let's see, another question that I was thinking about, that it was kind of unusual that Elvis's guide into the occult, the spiritual, was actually his hairdresser, Larry Geller, right? How did that come about?
Yeah, he was already leaning towards it. When he became famous, a lot of evangelical Christians turned on him. A lot of people worried because he was such a atomic bomb on culture. Government was worried, cultural leaders, and certainly religious leaders didn't like who Elvis was. That included his own pastor, who said he was playing with the devil. Billy Graham, the famous evangelical exemplar, denounced him publicly. And not even, even entertainment people like Frank Sinatra hated him, called him a flash in the pan. Jackie Gleason. But anyway, there was a lot of blowback, and Elvis was really injured because he was like, I was raised a Christian. And he got, you might say, sour about it. He started rethinking his Christianity. He always felt, even in the 50s, that reincarnation was more logical. theologically. He was reading things like Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. So he was already leaning there, and he was already open to it all. But it was in the, like around 64, that he was completely disillusioned. He was still broken about his mother. He was not happy with his wealth. He was doing all these shallow Hollywood movies, even though they were paying him millions of dollars for it. And he was one of the top grossing box office actors in Hollywood. But he felt empty. Like, this is not where I want to be. And as they say, when the pupil is ready, the master will show up. By strange happenstance, he was in L.A., but his hairdresser quit to open up his own business. And I was like, all right, fine. Can you recommend somebody? And he said, oh, I know this guy, Larry Geller. He's connected with stars. He's very talented. Larry showed up at Elvis's house and was cutting his hair. And there was no small talk. And for some reason, Elvis had this intuition to ask him, Larry, who are you? What are you about? What are you into? It's not something he would just bring up to a person on their first encounter.
Hairdresser.
Yeah, and Larry happened to be a very, very proficient New Ager occultist in all these disciplines from east to west. And Larry could have just, said, oh, no, I'm into, skating or something. Larry just kind of opened up and said, I'm into alternative spirituality and mystical Judaism and all that. And Elvis was like, thank you. This is what I want. They talked for 4 hours after that. 4 hours. Larry brought him all these books on occultism. And Elvis was off to the races, got into theosophy, Taoism, Kriya yoga, you name it. He was an exemplar, the symbol of an occultist, if you would, a magician.
What about Gnosticism? Did he ever get into that? That would be kind of contradictory to the Pentecostals, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, again, Elvis was moving away. He said, I don't like these Christianity with their hellfire and these churches that are just there to get rich. So he'd already moved away.
Yeah.
So he definitely delved into all forms of alternative Christianity, Gnosticism, the Mystical Christ by Manly P. Hall and others. Mm-hmm. And he delved into it, and that answered one of the big questions in his life, which is the Jesus he'd be looking for. He liked this cosmic Christ that resided within all of us, which Gnosticism and other sects talk about, and how this cosmic Christ is shining into the world, how we each can be a Jesus in ourselves if we are enlightened and if we wake up. And that's what he wanted, and it really opened. And it's a very inclusive Christianity, because a lot of these systems of theosophy talk about these enlightened masters, Jesus and Muhammad and Zoroaster and Buddha. And he thought, yes, it makes sense. Jesus is just part of these enlightened beings that change history and help mankind. And he loved that concept, and he thought, well, could I be that person? Because he really wanted to help humanity. He wanted to find God. He had all this wealth. He was the most famous person in the world. So he thought, maybe I could be that and help humanity. That was really one of his big desires.
How would you see his rise and fall through a Jungian lens?
Yeah, in the book, I talk about various reasons for his rise and fall. Jung is one of them. I also deal with Steiner, psychology, alchemy, the idea of egregores. But so Jung is one of them, and I offer different sub-hypotheses or theories in there. One of them is the archetypes. The archetypes are these formless images that are the construction of our psyche, and some say the universe itself. And there's all these archetypes, the mother, the father, the king, and all that. But unlike Plato's world of ideas, as Jung said, the archetypes are dynamic. They are quasi-conscious. They do have an agenda sometimes. They reside up there and within us. And Elvis might have been possessed too much by the archetype of the king, just as Marilyn Monroe got too possessed by the archetype of the princess. And archetypes, if you let them possess you, will eventually destroy you, even as you change history, because they have a mission to show,
Right.
king. I want the world to know what a king truly is. That's one of them. But then I offer perhaps he was the archetype of the trickster, this dynamic being on the edges that is there to help culture change, but turns everything upside down, like the coyote or Loki or Prometheus. But again, this archetype can be dangerous as it can be rewarding. And then the other one too under Jung is the idea that Jung actually admitted this at the end of his life when he was corresponding with Bill W., one of the co-founders, or the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill W. sent him some letters and said, the first 3 steps, I owe it to you because of a patient you had that I met, or I met his friend, and, a God of your own conception and all that. And Jung was very flattered, but they started corresponding. And Bill W.'s like, why is there destructive force? Jung said, there is probably an archetype that I call the devil, but we can call it destruction, Ragnarok, Kali. It's there just to destroy. That's its role. You can't say it's good or bad, right? Things got to end so that something begins. And when you're addicted to alcohol or drugs, you have your shadow, which is another problem that people have. If you don't deal with your shadow, which is all that you've repressed and you haven't worked it out, you start projecting it, it starts damaging your body. So you have this instance where the shadow is coming out and it's taking over you, and this archetype of the devil is coming in. They join, and they call it addiction, and this addiction says, no, our job is to destroy you, whether you're Jim Morrison, Elvis, or we've all met people like that, right? I'm a recovering addict, and there was a time it's almost like all I could do was destroy myself and what was around. I couldn't help it. And so that's one of the, theories that I go into the book.
Yeah, I mean, Jung also talks a lot about people being possessed by an archetype.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what this sounds like. Huh.
What kind of drugs was he addicted to? Do you know?
Mostly pills. I think, God, he had so many drugs in his system after he died. He started taking amphetamines when he was in the Army because of the back-breaking schedule that he had.
Yeah.
And it was normal for soldiers to do that in those days. So amphetamines became a big part of his, you might say, diet. Same with Philip K. Dick, because it made him work hard. I can work harder so I can buy more. That kind of
faster.
Yeah, and it helped them. I mean, they got things done. They produced a lot of content, as they say today. So is amphetamines, but then it started in the 60s and 70s, just started widening into other things, downers and uppers and different things. And he became, like Philip K. Dick, just a walking pharmacy story.
Yeah, but not hallucinogenics. He stayed away.
That one time with acid and then one time with marijuana. There was a time, I think, in the mid-70s when he was really touring hard that he did cocaine for like 2 months. But then he dropped it. He just needed it to be able to show up to work. But he never touched it again. So it was definitely the pills that got to him. And that's, unfortunately, as I say, individuals like Philip K. Dick and Elvis lived in a time where it was, street drugs are bad, but anything a doctor prescribes you is safe and effective, and he believed it. So did Philip K. Dick. And we all know you can get addicted to anything a doctor gives you.
Right. Yeah.
Now, what was your addiction? I'm curious.
Yeah, my drug of choice was cocaine. Yeah. Speed. Uppers. Anything that got me up.
Yeah.
How'd you break it?
Well, as they say, how do you know you've hit rock bottom? You stop digging. One day I said I didn't want to dig anymore. I was tired. I didn't want to, and I just got help. Went to rehab, started going to meetings, and started living a more spiritual life. And now I'm going, 13 years now. So very blessed.
Yeah. Yeah, I can remember in the late 70s, the cocaine was very available, and it was a social thing in my life. But then one day it just wasn't available anymore. And I just, quit cold turkey because it just wasn't around. which was fortunate that I don't have, apparently don't have an addictive personality, I guess. Another question I had, that Elvis was not anti-gay, but he wasn't bisexual either. I mean, he had gay people around him in his life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, he was very balanced, and going back to Jungian terms of his anima and animus. He understood men, he understood women. I think part of his charisma is that they say he was very vulnerable looking, very approachable looking, but he was still a man's man, you know. He always was packed with guns, and he loved to play football. He was this perfect balance, and he sort of changed the idea of what, you know, the leading man looks like. You know, it's no longer Gary Cooper with the chisel looks and all that. It's the more softer, effeminate, but still macho kind of guys. In the old days, we used to call them metrosexuals. Remember that term? It's like,
yes,
they're heterosexual, but they love women's fashion and makeup. You know, they know both sides of the aisle. So he was certainly a very balanced person, and he was always a live and let live kind of guy. When gay men would hit on him in the 50s and 60s, like, hey, now, you know, I appreciate it, but I just ain't into that stuff. And he was good friends with Liberace and all that. So there was, I know there's rumors that he might have been bisexual. And when you listen to Jailhouse Rock, when you listen to it, they're going to each other's cells for some loving. You're like, hold on a second. What is this song write? But he didn't write it. So there are rumors, but ultimately, I don't think he was. I think he was straight. But again, he was very connected to the other forces, the other genders, or the anima, as Jung would call it.
How did he maintain his career while he had this secret life, you know, practicing occult stuff? Because
he was just a hardworking guy. Yeah. It was always part of his life. I mean, as I write, if he was doing a movie set and it wasn't his turn to be, you know, acting, he would sit there and meditate or read or play the guitar. I know people have this thing of Elvis alone in his Vegas room, shooting TVs and all that, and isolated, which is true. But a lot of times he was meditating and reading. If he was in Graceland and he was in between movies or tour, he would get or in his Bel Air mansion and they came groupies or bodyguards, he would do a circle of people, and they would discuss, you know, higher metaphysical concepts or read from a book or meditate, or prayer groups. He was very big into prayer groups before his concert. So he knew how to be efficient with his time and sort of, you know, in between things, really, search, be a seeker, be a magician.
One of the things that he had in common with Liberace was the outfits. Can you talk a little bit about how did he get into that? You know, that very, you have some pictures in the back of the book of some of his famous outfits.
Yeah, well, it was Liberace. Liberace helped him out when he started in many ways. For example, gave him advice about being a twinless survivor. Liberace said, you know, don't focus on finding the answers of life. Just, you know, maximize your creativity and art and just love what you do. He also told Elvis, you need to wear jumpsuits. That, you know, this, you know, rockabilly stuff. No, wear jumpsuits. And when Elvis didn't do it, but it's something he later did in the late 60s. And I think his occultism influenced it a lot, because, you know, he was always with Egyptian motifs and Aztec motifs and the peacock, which is a very important symbol in Gnosticism and mystical traditions in the Middle East and Europe. And yeah, I mean, it was, and you look at his shows, it was all this sort of space age magical event. And as people have noticed, his Vegas costume, he was recreating his childhood hero, which is Captain Marvel and Captain Marvel Jr., you know, the short cape and all that. I mean, just, I have pictures, and if you think of, you know, we call him Shazam today. Yeah. But when you look at Shazam and Elvis, you're like, hey, it's the same thing. And so Shazam was one of them. And of course, as people are shocked, Elvis was a blonde. He was not a brunette. He dyed his hair. And people say, well, your hair is because of Tony Curtis. No, it was because of Captain Marvel, Shazam. He wanted that look. And even his collar, he'd have a raised collar. People would say, was he being Napoleon or is he being Captain Marvel? But he read a book called Through the Eyes of the Masters by David Andreas. And he was looking at this book and he saw that enlightened gurus always had their collars up. So he decided, I'm going to be like them and always have my collar up. So he had, he was definitely, again, very extraterrestrial, especially in his Vegas manifestation.
Very quickly, it is important in pop culture today to reference Shazam, DC's Captain Marvel, as Shazam, because the current day Captain Marvel is Carol Danvers, who is Brie Larson in the MCU. Elvis's influence was Shazam,
for sure. And he said it. I mean, he said it in interviews. This figure really huge inspiration where you can transform into something bigger, into a superhero.
And that was a thing in the DC Captain Marvel, which that was inherited from a previous publisher. But Shazam was the word that would invoke the transformation. But anyway, so yeah, Shazam.
That's
Miguel,
it.
How has your life changed as a result of writing this book? How has it affected you?
Well, at first people thought I was crazy because, again, my wife and friends, family, when I would do my podcast and I'd stop talking about Gnosticism, start talking about Elvis. He's finally lost the plot. He's finally broken. So, I'm very honored to have done a favor for a friend. I am not an Elvis fan. I'm still learning so much about him. But it was a favor that I did for an individual that needed my help, and I'm truly honored and blessed to do it. Of course, there are, again, sacrifices, staying up till late at night, writing for 3 or 4 hours a day, the toll that takes. I had no idea if I wanted to publish it or I just had to write it. No idea if anybody would like to publish it. Again, I was just doing what I was told. I was going with the flow of the universe. So it has taken its toll. Certainly, had to sacrifice a lot of work opportunities, time with people and all that. But I trust Elvis, and I'm assuming when the book comes out, or it's already coming out now, everything will be taken care of and balance itself out.
You have a good attitude.
Yeah.
You have a positive attitude.
So Elvis's exotic outfits were kind of counter to the trend of the late 60s, where at least the American rock and rollers were in dirty jeans and T-shirts. The British guys were wearing coats and ties, but the Americans were really on the down low on the outfits. And which leads me to the question, what did he think of the Beatles? What did he think of the rock and rollers in the late 60s?
Yeah, well, first of all, for the English, remember glam rock. Glam rock looked very much like Elvis in the early 70s, and David Bowie very much, and his designer said, we wanted Elvis jumpsuits. In fact, when David Bowie would finish a set with Rock and Roll Suicide as Ziggy Stardust, his last set was a white jumpsuit. And when he would leave, his manager, Tony DeFries, would say, David has left the building. So glam rock kind of, kept the Elvis jumpsuits and flashy diamonds and all that going with Elton John and Queen and all that. So, You're right. The Americans got grungy. But, the Beatles, well, he met them once. And because at the time, the Beatles were the biggest thing in the world. The Beatles obviously were hugely influenced by Elvis. There's a famous line by John Lennon, before Elvis, there was nothing. Because, people like Bob Dylan and John Lennon, when they heard Heartbreak Hotel, something woke up within them, something spiritual and amazing. And they said, this is a sound I want to go to. This is where I want to go to. So they were all huge Elvis fans. So they met him one time at his mansion, his Bel Air mansion. And it was kind of tense because the Beatles were stoned. Elvis was sober. and there was just no chemistry or synergy. And Elvis is like, if you guys are going to sit there with your jaws hanging from your mouth, on the floor, let's call it a night. And of course, the Beatles Elvis thing is happened because outside of this mansion, there were throngs of people, and on one side, the Elvis people, the other Beatles, and they're screaming at each other, Elvis, Beatles. But eventually they had a good conversation. And I always say it's unfortunate because George Harrison and Larry Geller went outside to smoke some weed and have a cigarette, and they started talking about Hinduism and Yogananda, and I always wish Elvis would have gone outside, because then he could have connected with George Harrison, and then on a spiritual level. In fact, George Harrison Elvis had been going to this ashram there for a while, and George Harrison started going there after Elvis. But it's a pity. Later on, Elvis had problems with her because he felt the country was falling apart. The 60s were a disappointment, all the deaths, Vietnam was raging, and he didn't like communism, so he started bad-mouthing the Beatles. And in fact, when he went to talk to Nixon, and his famous was like, this is narcotic. Again, street drugs are bad, but prescription, that delusion he had. So he thought the Beatles were the bad guys because of street drugs and their communism. So he did badmouth them. He thought they were bad influence. However, later on, when John Lennon was getting in trouble with the FBI and whatever, Lennon phoned Elvis and asked him for his advice because he didn't want to leave the country. And Elvis, said, denounce drugs publicly, bullshit, and helped him out. So that's really how much they influenced them. I know the Beatles went to, Ringo Starr went to some of his shows and stuff, but they only talked once.
How about Dylan? Did you ever meet Dylan?
No, Dylan, the story there is that obviously Dylan, again, hugely influenced by Elvis, but he wasn't able to, afford him or see him in the 60s and 50s. And in the 70s with his Vegas thing, Dylan was like, there were rumors about Elvis doing drugs, gaining weight. And Dylan was like, I have this idealized view of who my Elvis is. I don't want to ruin it. You know the saying, never meet your heroes, because they're just humans.
Yeah. Did Elvis have any particular vision of what the afterlife was like, what he was heading towards?
No, he believed in reincarnation. He believed in some sort of heavenly realm after you've done good for many lifetimes. So he never described it. So, but yeah, death was just like any shaman. Death and life are just intertwined. They're just part of each other, and he wasn't too worried.
Have you heard from any of the people who were involved in his life as a result of this book?
Not right now. No, they pretty much have ignored me because, remember, I'm not a biographer. I'm a guy who writes books about Gnosticism and a podcast. So, Larry Geller, and then also too, Larry Geller, he used to be very active on his Facebook. I know people said that he would always email people back, just the nicest guy. But recently, in the last few years, he is hitting his late 80s, so he's kind of retired. So I've tried to reach out to Elvis's granddaughter, Riley, and some others, but hopefully once the book gets some traction and people can read it, it would be great to have a conversation and get even more information, because I know whatever the book says, whatever Tillery's book says, or Larry Geller's, I bet we've only, it's the tip of the iceberg. There's about a lot of weird stuff that we don't know about Elvis, and it'd be great to dig it all out for the public.
Volume 2.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, aren't there some, you mentioned some fun facts about Elvis that are patently not true. What might some of those be?
Oh, boy. Well, again, he was a blonde. He didn't like street drugs. Even his death, I'm starting to wonder, again, I recreate his death and make it a ritual, but there are some arguments that say he did not die on the toilet, because his bathroom had a barber chair, and he loved, he loved reading, not when he was, going to the bathroom, but he liked reading on the barber chair when he was reading books, and he did die with, a book the book about the Shroud of Turin and the real face of Jesus. And some accounts say that, no, he never had his pants down to his ankles. So that's a rabbit hole I want to go to. It's like, well, what happened? So there's so many so many different stories. Some are contradicting. It's hard to say. I mean, he was so magical. It just never stops. It never.
Who found his body?
It was his girlfriend, Ginger. She was the first one. I think she heard a thump or something in the middle of the night. So,
yeah. Didn't he also have a vision or see image of Jesus in the clouds? But he also saw Stalin in that same image.
Yeah, that was his one mystical experience going through the desert. Again, he was frustrated not because of his wealth and the emptiness of being a celebrity, but because he wasn't growing as a spiritual being, and he was frustrated, and he had an argument with Larry, and Larry gave him that koan about an empty cup. You have to empty your cup or else you can't fill it with God. And Elvis listened because Elvis was meditating and all that, but he was mostly reading books. And Geller felt you filled your mind too much, empty it so that, these powers can come within you. And he did it. And suddenly they were driving, Elvis and Geller were driving through the Arizona desert, and the clouds started forming, and Elvis freaked out. He said, "Do you see it?" Geller's like, "I do see it." They stopped their car, they ran into the desert, and this face of Stalin came out. Again, by Stalin, it was obviously the manifestation of pure evil. Back in the 60s, evil, it wasn't Hitler, it was Stalin, because we had such bad relationships with the Soviets.
Right.
So it was also coming out. Remember, in the 50s and 40s, it was like Stalin's a good guy. But then after World War II, we started, oh my God, this guy was our ally, wasn't the Boy Scout we thought he was. He was a butcher. But anyway, so it was pure evil, and Elvis was like welcoming it. And Gary's like, this is evil. But in Elvis's mind, he realized he was impure. He had been egoic, and the evil in the sky, this evil was also within him. And he said, God, if I'm this person, just wipe me off. Take me off the chessboard. I screwed up. I've done bad. And what happened is when he said that, the face turned into Jesus, and this Christ energy came into him. And it was one of the most powerful events he ever had, and he never doubted what he was doing. What he was seeking, obviously, was never a straight path. But he did tell Geller many years later, if I hadn't met you and I hadn't had that experience, I would have been dead, before the 60s were over.
Yeah. I know we're at the end of the hour, but have you ever looked at any are there any similarities between Jim Morrison and Elvis? Because that story you just told sounds a lot like Jim Morrison. Yeah.
Yeah. We just did I just did a podcast last night on my new podcast, Gen X Wasteland, where we talk about Elvis and all that. And there is Paul Wilde put a book out on the occult Jim Morrison. And there are similarities in obviously their mysticism, their interests and everything. And obviously Jim Morrison, his idol is no surprise with Elvis. He was imitating this fusion of Elvis and the crooner for his persona. So yeah, definitely parallels.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, this has been great, Miguel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Miguel.
Thanks for joining the Mystical Underground. Visit www.themysticalunderground.com for the latest blog post and book info. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Listen to the podcast at podcast.themysticalunderground.com. Follow Trish and Rob on Instagram at Trish and Rob McGregor. Follow us on Twitter at The Mystic Cast. Send email to podcast@themysticalunderground.com. And until next week, thank you for listening and stay mystical.